In 1790, a French expedition buried gold in the Rockies. Only one man survived. He drew a map and then vanished. For 200 years, men followed his clues. Some found bones, others, nothing. What else was sealed beneath stone? A silk map folded in leather, a chalice etched in gold, a cave never opened. From 1790 to the 1990s, hunters searched. Ledgers recorded symbols, then ended mid-line. When gold was hidden, what else was buried with it? Welcome to history's ledger. In 1790, a French expedition crossed into what was then Spanish Louisiana. They were looking for minerals. Some say they found more than they imagined. According to the fragments left behind, they smelted gold into long ingots, too heavy to carry east. So they buried it in the shadow of the Rockies. Only one man survived. His name was LeBlanc. He carried a silk map folded in leather, marked with 8 symbols: a chalice, a pair of boots, a cross, a line of mountains, and other signs that could only be read when light fell at a certain hour. He returned to the frontier, handed the map to kin and officials, and then vanished from history. For 2 centuries, hunters followed the drawings. Some returned empty-handed, others never returned at all. This is not just the story of hidden gold. It is the story of maps unfinished, ledgers that end mid-line, and objects that survived longer than the men who buried them. The first mystery isn't the gold, it's the map. The map does not appear in archives. No accession number, no bound ledger listing, no historian pointing to a glass case with a tag that reads LeBlanc, 1790. Instead, it surfaces in fragments. A sheet of silk passed down through families, unrolled carefully at kitchen tables. A folded scrap tucked into a wallet and shown only in private. A drawing copied by hand, each version slightly different, each one treated like the key to something hidden. The silk itself feels improbable. Why silk, when parchment or paper were far easier to find? And yet it makes sense. Silk bends without cracking. It folds flat without tearing. It resists damp and survives travel better than paper could. Whoever drew those symbols chose a material meant to last. The case that held it was leather, worn smooth from years of handling, its seams darkened by oil and weather. Not a grand object, not meant for display, but functional, strong, secretive. When the map is opened, the drawings are small but deliberate. A chalice sketched beside the outline of a mountain ridge, a pair of boots, heel to heel, as though marking a stance or a place to begin. A cross, drawn not like a grave but a compass point. There are lines that echo the ridges of the Rockies, one peak notched as though broken, and then the stranger marks. A circle, a line, a symbol, said to reveal itself only at dawn, when a shadow falls across stone at a precise angle. The symbols make sense alone. Together, they refuse to align. Some copies reverse the order, as if the scribe misremembered. Others omit half the marks. A few add words like dig or here, and then stop abruptly, as though someone began to explain and lost the courage to finish. The result is not a single map, but a family of maps, cousins, not twins, all sharing the same ancestry, but none agreeing on the details. The only certainty is this: LeBlanc survived when no one else did. He returned with the story of caches of gold, hidden because they were too heavy to move. He returned with symbols that promised direction but not certainty. And then he was gone. Family papers mention ingots, nearly a forearm long, stacked inside wooden chests lined with iron. One story insists that a gold chalice was recovered from the mountains decades later and quietly kept in the LeBlanc household, never displayed, never proven. Others speak of the silk itself, stained at the folds, handled until the edges began to fray. Each account is half truth, half memory, repeated because absence leaves room for belief. What makes the map endure isn't that it proves the treasure exists, it's that it refuses to let the story die. Every copy is incomplete, every line slightly suspect. Yet the silk, the leather, and the stubborn repetition of those symbols keep the search alive. It is less a guide than an invitation, an unfinished sentence waiting for someone to complete it. In 1790, the French expedition left the banks of the Mississippi and moved west into what was then Spanish Louisiana. The journals that survive don't describe much in detail, but the silence is telling. The men were traders, soldiers, and laborers, hundreds strong. They carried tools, food, muskets, and the iron kettles needed to smelt whatever ore they found. The land did not make it easy. Crossing the plains, they followed rivers because there were no roads. The wind carried dust across their faces until their lips cracked and their tongues felt swollen. The taste of brackish water lingered in their mouths for days. Boots stiffened with mud. Leather straps rubbed skin raw. The air carried the smell of smoke from their own fires, but also the rot of animal carcasses along the trail. By the time the Rockies came into view, the men must have felt both awe and dread. Mountains taller than anything most of them had ever seen rose like walls, jagged and endless. The snow at the peaks shone white against the sky, but the closer they climbed, the more it melted into mud and stone. Cold streams cut across the slopes. The sound of water over rocks was constant, filling their camps at night with a noise that kept them from ever feeling completely still. They prospected where they could, panning in streams and chipping at exposed veins of rock. The first flakes of gold must have seemed miraculous, a glint of yellow in the bottom of a pan after weeks of blistered hands and hollow stomachs. Some claim they struck veins strong enough to smelt, and so they did, feeding ore into fire until the smoke stung their eyes and the smell of charred rock and sweat coated their clothes. The result was heavy, bars nearly 18 inches long, smooth at the edges, hot to the touch even after cooling. They wrapped them in cloth, lifted them into chests reinforced with iron, and counted what they could not possibly carry home. This was triumph. but it carried with it the beginning of collapse. Winter came earlier than they expected. The air grew sharp. The first snows closed in around their camps. Firewood grew scarce. The taste of stale bread and dried meat turned bitter. Men began coughing, their joints swollen, their faces hollowed by sickness. What had started as a dream of wealth now felt like a weight pressing against them, heavier than the ingots themselves. The Ute watched from a distance. For generations they had lived with these mountains, taking from the land what could be replenished. They saw strangers hacking into rock, piling earth, carrying metal that had no meaning in their own traditions. It must have felt like desecration. One night, arrows cut through the air. The men heard the sound before they felt it, a whistle, then the shock of impact. Muskets fired back. The mountains echoed with screams and the crack of iron. What followed is hard to know in detail. Some journals mention disease. Others speak of attacks. Many of the men simply disappeared, their bones left in valleys where snow covered them. By the time the fighting ended, the French numbers had collapsed. Those who remained could not carry the gold. They buried it instead. 3 caches, hidden in the mountain's shadow. The map says symbols were carved into stone piles, markers to guide them back in spring. But spring never came. LeBlanc walked east alone, carrying the memory of chests he could not lift, and the silence of men who did not rise from the ground. His map survived, the others did not. The sound of boots across frozen earth, the smell of smoke clinging to torn coats, the feel of frost in lungs already weakened. These are the things the expedition carried out of the mountains. Gold was left behind. What they brought with them was grief. By autumn, the expedition had grown too weak to carry their discovery further. The caches of bullion were both triumph and burden, gleaming bricks that could not feed on man, too heavy to be dragged over mountains, too valuable to march openly into Spanish towns. The decision was grim, but necessary. They would hide what they could not move. One chest was lowered into a hollow near the base of a ridge, the soil packed back into place and disguised with stones. Another was said to be buried beside a stream, where the current would mask any sign of disturbed earth. The third was hidden deeper, marked with a mound of rocks, stacked so neatly it could pass for a natural rise, except to those who knew to look for it. Symbols were cut into stone as reminders, a cross etched into granite, a pair of boots carved heel to heel, faint and crude, yet distinct enough to be recognized later. A chalice, sketched onto silk, to hold the memory when the mountain's face forgot. The men worked in silence, their breath visible in the thinning air. They touched the metal one last time, not as owners but as mourners. To some, those bars must have felt like the end of months of hunger and blistered hands. To others, they was simply weight, a cruel reminder that fortune meant nothing if you could not keep breathing long enough to claim it. The air was sharp with the smell of fresh turned earth. The stones scraped against raw palms. The sound of picks and shovels rang out and then faded into wind. When the last mound was closed, the ground looked almost untouched, save for the faint marks no one else would understand. As they left, each man carried less than he had hoped. A musket, a knife, a pouch of flour, if he was lucky. What they did not carry was the treasure that had brought them there. In the end, the burial was less about secrecy than survival. They left behind what they could not lift, hoping the mountain would keep it safe. The map recorded the clues. The rest was silence. For those who walked away, the memory of where they dug may have felt heavier than the gold itself. The gold was hidden, but the men remained. They carried frost in their lungs and weakness in their bones. The sound of boots dragging across frozen earth replaced the clamor of shovels. Meals dwindled to strips of hide boiled into bitter broth. Some chewed leather belts until their mouths bled. Illness hollowed them, their joints swelled, their faces turned gray. The smell of sickness, sour, metallic, hung inside the tents. Even the air seemed heavy, pressing down on lungs that could not fill. A few tried to keep records. Thin pages in ledgers note weather, distances, and then simply stop, mid-line. One page ends with the men and nothing more. Another shows a sketch of a ridge with a mark where a chalice should have been, the ink running as if water or tears smeared it. Luxury remained, but it no longer promised comfort. A silk scarf, stiff with frost, once worn for pride, now wrapped around a fevered neck. A silver cup used to scoop snow when water ran out. Boots polished in France now torn and soaked, their soles flapping loose. Even the ingots, smooth, shining, stacked in memory, were spoken of like ghosts. At night, the mountains carried sound strangely. A cough echoed against stone until it felt like a chorus. The crack of branches outside a tent made men reach for muskets with trembling hands. Wind whistled through mounds that concealed the gold, a reminder of weight left behind, unclaimed. The attacks came without warning. Arrows cut the air with a hiss, sharper than breath. Muskets fired, the smell of powder mixing with the stench of unwashed bodies and sweat. Screams bounced between ridges. Some men fell where they stood, their blood darkening the ground. Others fled into the trees, leaving packs, tools, and journals in the dirt. By winter's end, their numbers were broken. The valley was littered with torn fabric, abandoned pans, shattered chests, and bones stripped bare by animals. What remained were fragments: a carved cross on a stone, a pair of boots found years later, their leather split but still marked with initials, a scrap of silk map folded too many times, stained dark at the edges. The treasure was hidden, the men were not, and LeBlanc, the sole survivor, carried both memory and silence eastward, leaving behind more questions than answers, and a map that would never explain itself completely. When spring came, the mountains did not soften enough to save them. Snowmelt flooded streams, and the ground turned to mud. What had once been chests of gold now lay hidden beneath stone mounds, while men staggered eastward, thinner, fewer, desperate. LeBlanc was among them. Accounts differ on what he carried. Some say he brought nothing but memory, the details of 3 burial sites etched into his mind. Others claim he clutched papers in his coat, torn journal pages, sketches, and finally, a map drawn not on parchment, but on silk. The choice of silk was unusual, but deliberate. Paper would have torn under damp or folded too often. Parchment could have stiffened, cracked, even rotted in the rain. Silk bent and survived. It carried the faint smell of oil, the touch of fabric cool beneath the fingers, smooth even when creased. Wrapped in leather, the case shut neatly, a private archive no larger than a folded handkerchief. Inside were symbols, 8 in all. The chalice, drawn with enough detail to suggest it was not imagined, but once seen, perhaps even held. A pair of boots, heel to heel, odd in their plainness but distinct. A cross, its lines sharp and direct. A ridge of mountains, one notch carved deeper than the rest. Other marks, a circle, a line, a sign meant to be read not in ink, but in shadow. When the sun struck stone at 6 in the morning and a shape fell into alignment, the map did not tell its story with words. It told it with signs, with silence, with absence. Each copy since has changed, symbols rearranged, orders reversed, words half finished. The silk original, if it ever left LeBlanc's hands, was never catalogued. No record of it exists in any official archive. What he gave instead were copies. One to his family, who guarded it quietly, turning it into an heirloom whispered of, but rarely shown. Another, some say, to French officials, though no state inventory lists it. And then LeBlanc himself disappeared from history. No journal entries, no further expeditions, no grave marked with his name. What remained was the map, and with it, the burden of grief disguised as direction. Imagine LeBlanc drawing it, hands still raw from cold, eyes hollowed by hunger, memory of men buried beneath snow, still sharp. Each symbol placed not only to guide, but to survive him. Each crease in the silk, a fold against forgetting. Luxury persisted even here, but in strange ways. The silk and leather were not decoration, they were protection. The chalice, etched in gold and carried in memory onto the page, represented more than wealth. It was ceremony, a ritual object. The boots marked on the map were not fine, polished leather, but the reminder of footsteps over frozen earth. And the ingots, heavy and smooth, stacked in ornate chests deep in the ground, remained only as absence, fortune transformed into a burden too great to carry. The mystery loops back here. Did LeBlanc truly bury what he described? Did the map record exact sites, or was it a ritual of grief, a way to mark the fact that so many had died for nothing? Was the chalice a real artifact, or a symbol meant to stand in for all that was lost? The family who claimed his legacy insisted the map was real. They described its folds, the feel of the leather, the ink smeared at the edge of a ridge. But when asked to prove it, they stayed quiet, perhaps out of fear, perhaps because silence gave the story more weight than words ever could. For 200 years, hunters unfolded copies of that same silk. They traced the chalice, the boots, the cross. They counted the peaks. They waited for shadows at dawn. And each time, the ground remained silent, the stones indifferent. The gold was hidden, the map survived, and the silence around it became the truest treasure of all. After LeBlanc vanished from the record, the silence did not close the story. Instead, it moved into the homes of those who claimed to be his kin. The map, or at least its copies, became an heirloom, folded, unfolded, whispered about, argued over. It was never displayed. It was kept in drawers, in chests, in the bottom of travel cases lined with fabric. Some said it was wrapped in leather, darkened with oil and time. Others described the faint gleam of silk stained at the folds. No two accounts agreed perfectly, but all agreed on the same feeling, that this was not a relic meant for strangers. It was for family, and family alone. The LeBlanc descendants rarely spoke of it publicly. When they did, it was in half sentences. The chalice, someone would say, without explaining further. Or, the boots carved in stone, as if the phrase itself carried weight too dangerous to elaborate. This secrecy became part of the legend. Some hunters claimed they saw the map once, in a kitchen lit by lamplight, spread across a table where wine glasses stood half empty. They said the ink looked faded, but the symbols were clear. The cross, the boots, the chalice, the mountains with the notch. The man who showed it never explained why he trusted them enough to let them look. And just as quickly, he rolled it back into leather and tucked it away, as though he had shown too much already. Other stories say the family possessed more than the map, that a gold chalice lifted from the expedition before its collapse had been kept in their house for years. It was never displayed, never proven, but described in detail, etched with unfamiliar marks, its surface tarnished at the rim, heavy when lifted. If it existed, it was both treasure and warning, a fragment of the fortune, but also a reminder of the blood and frost that came with it. The inheritance was not only objects, it was silence itself, a way of speaking less than you knew, a way of leaving ledgers unfinished, pages trailing into nothing. Each generation faced the same choice: treat the map as memory, or treat it as promise. Some folded it back and refused to go further. Others risked their lives searching the mountains, hoping the symbols meant more than grief. A few returned with nothing but stories of carved rocks and strange alignments at dawn. Others did not return at all. The silence deepened with every retelling. The map was never given to an archive, never studied by officials beyond rumor. No catalog listed it. No institution ever held it. What survived were copies, drawings on paper, sometimes embroidered into cloth by hands, that wanted to keep it safe when ink ran thin, and each copy added its own distortions, like a reflection across rippling water. By the 19th century, the LeBlanc family name had already blurred. Some claimed descent, others insisted the line had ended. The only thing that kept the story alive was the map itself, or the belief that it existed. That is the true inheritance. Not the gold, not the chalice, not the silk folded into leather, but the silence that carried across centuries, heavier than the ingots left in stone. A silence that drew outsiders in, while those who lived with it learned how to never speak too much. By the middle of the 19th century, the silence could no longer hold. Outsiders began to circle the story, drawn by fragments of conversation, by whispered claims of a silk map folded into leather, by symbols too strange to ignore. Prospectors in New Mexico told of French descendants carrying a chart marked with boots and crosses. Ranchers near the San Luis Valley spoke of strangers walking the ridges at dawn, waiting for the moment when shadows might point to the earth. In taverns, men described ornate chests too heavy to move, left beneath cairns that no one had yet dared to break open. The family still guarded its versions, but copies had leaked, crude sketches, half remembered from brief glances, passed hand to hand. And with each new version, the mystery deepened. Which was the true order of the symbols? Which mountain ridge held the notch? Was the chalice a real object, or only a mark? Treasure hunters did what descendants would not. They went into the Rockies with shovels, muskets, and blind conviction. They found stone piles that looked deliberate, crosses carved faintly into granite, boots etched into a boulder near a stream. But every time they dug, the ground gave nothing but more stone. Still, the obsession grew. Some hunters swore they saw the chalice itself, passed quietly in a farmhouse, its gold dull with age. Others claimed the silk map smelled faintly of leather and smoke, proof it had been folded and carried through storms. A few brought home boots, said to have belonged to the expedition, cracked, stiff, and heavy with mud, as though leather could carry truth across generations. But for every object claimed, another was doubted. Was the chalice real? Was the silk stained by time, or simply by imagination? Did LeBlanc mark truth, or did he leave behind grief disguised as symbols? Ledgers of the search began to echo the old ones, entries about ridges, cairns, dawn light, and then silence, lines ending mid-thought, journals lost in rivers, men vanishing into snow. The mountain gave back fragments, never answers. And so the question stretched across decades. Why did the gold remain hidden when maps, symbols, and stories persisted? Why did silence outlast certainty? And most haunting of all, if the caches were real, what else lies buried beneath stone? A chalice etched in gold? A silk map folded too many times? Or nothing at all? The 19th century promised fortune in every canyon, gold in California, silver in Nevada, and somewhere in the Colorado Rockies. an older fortune already buried, waiting. Hunters who followed the whispers of LeBlanc's map spoke of signs in stone, a cairn that seemed too neat to be natural, a cross scratched shallow into granite, boots carved heel to heel, faint but deliberate. They swore these were not accidents of rock but markers. Each one meant they were close. They dug where symbols led them. The soil was hard, roots tangled like ropes. Hours passed, days, and each time only earth. No chest, no ingot, no chalice. The mountain took more than patience. It took men. One prospector died in a rock slide, stones tumbling as if the cairn itself rejected disturbance. Another was found by his own campfire, fevered and delirious, repeating the same word over and over, boots. Some vanished entirely, their ledgers ending mid-sentence left behind in packs recovered years later. And yet, silence did not deter others. Stories say one hunter saw the silk map itself, unrolled in a farmhouse, its folds creased deep, its symbols dark, even after decades. He swore the chalice drawn on its face matched a relic kept in a trunk nearby, heavy, tarnished, etched with strange marks. He was never able to prove it. He died before he could return with it. The obsession was not just about gold. It was about the allure of luxury sealed beneath wilderness. Smooth bars of bullion stacked in ornate chests. A chalice that gleamed even in shadow. A silk map folded so many times that it seemed almost alive, carrying memory in its threads. These details pulled men across rivers, into blizzards, into avalanches, and always the same question lingered. Were they following truth or chasing grief, dressed as symbols? The mountains held their silence. Hunters left with nothing but stories, journals that stopped mid-line, and the sense that the ground itself was watching. But the search did not stop, because obsession does not end with death. It spreads, and with every life lost, the question only grew heavier. If men could die for it, did that not prove the treasure was real? Or did it prove the silence was stronger than them all? 50 years after the French expedition collapsed in the Rockies, a new figure appeared in the story. He was said to be a grandson of LeBlanc, a man who walked into the town of Taos carrying a folded chart. Not parchment, not paper, a map on cloth, aged and stained, its lines traced with symbols too familiar to dismiss. He told anyone who would listen that the chart had belonged to his grandfather, the only survivor of that doomed expedition of 1790. It showed where the gold was buried. The people of Taos had heard this kind of talk before. Prospectors came often, some with maps, some with stories, most with empty hands. Gold fever had already burned through the region, leaving behind more broken men than riches. At first they dismissed him as another dreamer, but then he unrolled the cloth. The symbols were there, the chalice, the boots, the cross. A mountain ridge drawn with a single notch, and the faint instructions about a shadow that would fall across stone at 6 a.m, pointing toward the place where digging should begin. What made it convincing was not the story, but the material. The cloth felt too fine to be ordinary, smooth to the touch, flexible after decades. The ink bled faintly into the fibers, but the marks were still clear. Some swore it was silk, wrapped in leather, cracked with age, the edges darkened by oil. It was the kind of material no ordinary prospector would carry into wilderness. It felt like something chosen for endurance, not display. With him was a Mexican guide named Bernardo Sanchez. The two set out into the mountains together, climbing ridges, following rivers, searching for the markers drawn decades before. At first, the clues seemed to match. A cairn here, too neat to be natural. A rock face scratched faintly with lines that could pass for boots. The men grew excited, their energy sharpened by the idea that the map was leading them true. They dug. They followed the chart. They searched for months, but the ground gave nothing. Each cairn revealed only more stone. Each symbol proved uncertain. The boots nothing more than cracks in granite. The cross, a scratch shaped by water. Then came the attack. Accounts say that Ute warriors struck, as they had half a century before, swift and merciless, arrows cutting through camp, horses scattering into the trees. Men fell where they stood, their bodies torn, their cries echoing off stone. The grandson of LeBlanc did not survive. Sanchez escaped. In his pocket, he carried the map, the cloth stained darker now, the folds creased deeper, the symbols no less haunting. He claimed that one of the dying Frenchmen whispered a final clue: stand atop a false burial mound at dawn, and the shadow of your head will mark where the treasure lies. Sanchez spent years chasing that shadow. He found mounds. He stood at 6 a.m, waiting for the line to fall across the earth. He dug where it pointed. He found nothing. The map remained. So did the silence. For those who heard Sanchez tell the story, the cloth became more important than the gold. They described its folds, the smell of leather, the faint stains at the edges. They said the chalice sketched on its surface looked more like an object remembered than an invention, as though someone had held the real thing before drawing it. But each time the cloth was unrolled, questions deepened. Was it the same silk carried by LeBlanc? Was it a faithful copy, or another variation? One more cousin in a family of maps that never agreed. Did the chalice represent a real artifact? Or was it a ritual symbol meant to bind grief into something tangible? And if a map could travel across generations, changing hands, stained and creased but never destroyed, then what else had been carried forward in silence? Sanchez never found the gold, but by surviving, he carried the obsession into another century. The story moved again, no longer just about a French expedition lost to disease and arrows, but about a map that would not die, a silk inheritance that drew men to mountains and left them with nothing but hunger, grief, and questions too heavy to bury. The chalice, the boots, the cross, the mountain. They lingered like ghosts on silk. And for every man who failed to find the treasure, the map itself became the greater mystery. By the 1870s, the story of LeBlanc's map no longer belonged only to families. Prospectors, drifters, and professionals began to take it up. Men who had already scraped fortunes from Nevada's silver veins and Colorado's own gold rush towns. They arrived with copies of the symbols, crude sketches passed hand to hand, each one promising that this time the chest would open, the ingots would gleam, the chalice would be lifted into light. William Ewell was one of them. He studied ledgers, compared cairns to maps, convinced that the silk chart, or what survived of it, was more than rumor. His partner, Asa Poor, brought experience and cunning. Together they followed the symbols across ridges and valleys. At first, their faith was rewarded. They found markers that matched, crosses on stone, lines etched faintly into granite, a cairn that rose too neatly from the earth to be natural. The boots, always the boots. They dug where the map led them. Hours stretched into days. The soil turned to bone, white gravel. Their hands blistered. At dawn, they stood atop a burial mound, as instructed, waiting for the shadow to fall. They dug where it pointed, and still, nothing. Their obsession grew heavier than the ore they dreamed of lifting. They brought in instruments sold as mineral rods, devices said to quiver when gold lay underground. They followed where the rods pointed. Once, they found what seemed to be an opening, a man-made tunnel, narrow, cut into stone. Paul lowered himself inside, lantern in hand. His heart raced. His eyes searched for the glint of ingots, the smooth edge of a chest, the curve of a chalice. He found emptiness. The journals they kept show the progression, sketches of ridges, notes on cairns, measurements of shadows. Then the handwriting weakens, the lines grow shorter, and eventually the pages stop, blank after months of fevered entries. They left broke, tired, angry at the silence of the ground, their fortunes spent not on gold, but on the search for it. But they were not the last. Each failed hunt seemed to birth another. Each silence deepened the allure. If men of skill, wealth, and determination could not find it, didn't that prove the treasure was still there, waiting for someone who could? The chalice, the silk map, the boots carved in stone. They lingered in every telling, drawing more men toward the mountains, leaving behind ledges that ended mid-line and the faint smell of smoke in abandoned camps. The treasure remained hidden, the mystery alive. What about you? Would you have dug until your hands bled? If this story held you, let us know. Like this video, leave a comment, subscribe for more forgotten ledgers of American history. The most elusive clue on LeBlanc's map was not the chalice or even the boots. It was the shadow. Hunters wrote that the chart showed a cairn, a false burial mound, built of stones stacked carefully by hand. At 6 a.m. on a September day, the rising sun would cast a shadow from its peak. Where that shadow touched, the ground was to be opened. It sounded precise. It sounded final. So they waited. Yule and Por camped beside a mound they believed matched the symbol. They rose in darkness, frost biting their lips, breath curling in the air. The ground was stiff with cold, the smell of wet stone rising as they scraped their shovels into earth to mark the spot. Lanterns were extinguished, watches were checked. The horizon glowed faint orange. Birds stirred in the brush. Then the sun rose. The shadow stretched slowly, falling across stone, then earth, until it settled on a patch of ground bare of roots. They dug. The soil was hard, gravel cutting into their palms when the handles of their tools slipped. Sweat froze at their brows. The sound of shovels striking rock echoed in the valley. They dug until the hole was deep enough to swallow them whole, and when the shovels struck nothing but more stone, they dug deeper. What did they expect to see? The smooth edge of a chest? The glint of bullion? The curve of a chalice catching first light? The ground offered only silence. Some said they were at the wrong mound. Others whispered the shadow itself was a trick, that the alignment had shifted with years, that mountains do not hold still for human memory. A few suggested that LeBlanc had never meant the shadow to lead to gold, but to grief itself, to the place where his companions had been buried. No one could prove which was true, but hunters returned year after year, watching the same shadow fall across earth, convincing themselves that this time the ground would open and reveal ingots, smooth as glass, sealed inside ornate chests. Each sunrise gave them hope. Each day's digging left them hollow. The chalice never appeared. The shadow fell as it always had, and then faded, and with it, the certainty that anything lay beneath. For decades, the symbols led only to cairns and shadows. Then, hunters claimed to find something different, not a mark on stone, but a passage cut into the mountain itself. The discovery came after weeks of digging. The ground gave way beneath their picks, revealing a hollow. At first, it was only a crack, wide enough to admit a lantern. But the walls were squared, not natural. The air inside smelled stale, damp, heavy, with stone dust. When Asapor lowered himself into the opening, his heart hammered, as if every step might be the one that revealed treasure. His boots scraped against rock. His hands pressed against walls that felt too smooth to be the work of nature. The tunnel stretched ahead, low enough that he had to crouch. The lantern flickered. Shadows jumped across damp walls. He listened for sound, water, wind, anything, but heard only his own breath, uneven against the silence. At the end, he expected to see something glint, the corner of a chest, the edge of a bar of gold, perhaps even the curve of the chalice etched onto LeBlanc's map. What he found was nothing. The tunnel ended in blank stone. No cache, no chest, no ingot smooth as glass. Still, the absence did not end the story. In fact, it deepened it. Why had the tunnel been cut? Who had taken the trouble to carve it into granite, to make walls that bore the marks of tools, only to leave it empty? Had they removed the treasure? Had they hidden it further? Or had it never been there at all? Hunters who followed after swore the passage was real. Some said they smelled the faint tang of smoke, as though torches had once burned there. Others described carvings, faint marks of boots on stone, scratches that could pass for letters, though none were clear. One man claimed he lowered his lantern and saw the impression of a chest in the dirt, a rectangular hollow where something heavy had once rested. He swore he could still feel the outline with his hand, but when others returned, the ground revealed only dust and rock. Luxury remained a whisper, never proof. The silk map promised ornate chests lined with iron. The chalice remained a symbol more powerful than the gold itself. But the tunnel in stone, damp, empty, echoing, became another ledger that ended mid-line, another silence heavier than the metal it was meant to reveal. Every passage discovered since has carried the same question. Were the French hiding fortune, or were they leaving behind grief carved into rock? The legend of Treasure Mountain was not carried only by hunters who came and went. It lived in families, in the way a folded map was passed from one hand to the next, in how silence itself became inheritance. Descendants of LeBlanc spoke carefully. A grandfather would hint at the chalice, describing it not as if he had seen it recently, but as though the memory itself was part of the heirloom. A mother would mention boots carved in stone, then stop mid-sentence, leaving her children with more curiosity than certainty. They were not telling stories, they were keeping distance. The map, or what remained of it, was folded into leather, softened by oil and years of touch. Each time it was unrolled, the silk smelled faintly of dust and smoke, as if it had been carried through campfires long extinguished. The drawings had grown faint, the ink smudged at edges. Still, the symbols were recognizable: the chalice, the boots, the cross, the mountains with their notch. No one in the family treated it like paper. They treated it like bone, fragile, sacred, not to be displayed, not to be trusted to strangers. Visitors who saw it described the way light caught the fibers of silk, how the fabric seemed alive when moved in lamplight. They remembered the careful way it was rolled back, tied with leather cord, placed inside a chest lined with fabric. And they remembered the silence afterward, as though no one in the room wanted to risk speaking too much. Some families whispered that they held more than the map, that a gold chalice etched with strange marks had been lifted from the mountain and kept in a trunk. It was never shown, only described, heavy in the hand, tarnished at the rim, carried from house to house until the story of it felt heavier than the object itself. Whether it existed or not was almost irrelevant. Its presence in words gave it weight. What passed through families was not just objects, but rituals. Pages in ledgers that trailed off, diaries that ended in half phrases, as though someone thought better of committing everything to paper. Some stories were embroidered into cloth, symbols stitched in thread when ink grew too faint. Others were folded into silence, passed as nothing more than a look between elders and children when the word treasure was mentioned. By the late 19th century, the obsession had spread beyond kin. But in those houses where silk was folded and leather cases clicked shut, the silence endured. Outsiders sought answers, insiders guarded absences. It was not greed that silenced them, it was grief, carried too long. Men had died for those symbols. Families remembered that. The weight of the story was heavier than any bar of gold hidden under stone. One question has always remained: did they keep the silence because they were protecting a fortune, or because they knew there was nothing to find? A map that folds too easily, a chalice described but never shown, a leather case that smells faintly of smoke each time it is opened. These became more than heirlooms, they became burdens, and so the families lived with them, not to share, not to prove, but to preserve, in silence. By the late 19th century, the legend had spread so far that silence was no longer enough. Hunters wanted evidence. Historians asked for records. Newspapers printed retellings with headlines that promised more certainty than the families themselves were ever willing to give. Proof was demanded, but proof was the one thing the mountain never offered. Treasure seekers carried back fragments, a stone carved faintly with a cross, boots found in soil, cracked and stiff, the stitching still visible where leather met sole, a tarnished cup said to gleam faintly when polished, described as gold, etched with marks that resembled vines. These were presented as evidence, but each artifact slipped quickly into rumor. Some disappeared into trunks. Others were dismissed as coincidence. A few were quietly sold. The silk map itself was the most contested. Copies surfaced across the West, each claiming to be traced from the original. Some were drawn on parchment, others on linen, one even embroidered into cloth. Each copy included the same essential symbols: the chalice, the boots, the cross, the ridge with a notch. But the order changed. The scale shifted, the details blurred. Hunters argued about which version was true. Families argued about whether any of them were true, and the mountain remained indifferent, holding its silence beneath stone and snow. The demand for proof did not stop. Men brought instruments designed to locate mineral veins, rods said to bend toward gold. They reported tunnels cut into granite, their walls smooth, their air stale. Some swore they smelled faint smoke inside, as if torches had once burned there. Others said they felt impressions in the dirt shaped like chests, hollows where heavy weight had once rested. But when these discoveries were examined later, the ground revealed nothing. The smoke could have been memory. The chest-shaped hollows vanished beneath rain. Even the tunnels, when revisited, seemed less like deliberate passages and more like accidents of stone. Proof remained elusive. Luxury, however, persisted in whispers. The chalice described but never shown. The silk that smelled faintly of smoke, folded into leather darkened by age. Chests said to be ornate, lined with iron, filled with ingots, smooth as glass. These details returned again and again. not as physical evidence but as memory artifacts, fragments too persistent to fade, too uncertain to verify. The newspapers learned to feed on the lack of closure. Treasure Mountain gives up nothing, one headline declared. Another called it the gold that refuses men. Journalists reported stories of hunters found dead in snow, their ledgers ending mid-sentence, their shovels left upright in frozen earth. The articles rarely offered more than rumor, but rumor was enough. What fascinated the public was not the gold itself, but the refusal of gold to be proven. If ingots had been unearthed, the mystery would have ended. Instead, it lived on, made stronger by every failed attempt to settle it. This is the paradox of proof. The more it is demanded, the less it appears. And so the chalice remained unverified. The silk stayed folded. The map lingered in copies that contradicted one another. And families who had inherited silence clutched their heirlooms tighter, knowing that to share them was to lose the one thing that gave them power: absence. If you had been there, standing in a parlor as a map was unrolled, the ink faint, the fabric smooth, would you have demanded proof? Would you have asked to see the chalice itself? Or would you have understood that the silence was the point, that mystery outlives certainty, and that sometimes absence is the only treasure strong enough to endure? The search for gold in the Rockies was never measured only in maps or symbols. It was measured in lives. Men entered the mountains with shovels and hope, certain that this time the silk map would prove true. They walked away empty-handed, if they walked away at all. Some froze before they reached tree line. Others were caught in storms that erased their camps in hours. A few were found years later, their bones scattered beside rusted tools, boots stiff with rot, journals ending mid-line. The grief of those who survived was quieter, but no less sharp. They had sold farms to fund expeditions, leaving families waiting for fortunes that never came. Wives pawned wedding rings to pay debts. Children grew up in houses where silence was heavier than bread. For those who lived with the legend, regret became its own inheritance. A father who had carried the map into the mountains returned with nothing but a cough and frost-bitten hands. A son who promised to finish what his grandfather had begun never came home. Their absence weighed more than the gold ever could. Even objects seemed to carry sorrow. A chest, described as ornate and lined with iron, was remembered not for its promise of bullion, but for how it was lost, buried forever beneath stone. A chalice, whispered of in families, became less a sign of fortune than of blood, its imagined surface etched with grief. The silk map itself, smooth, fragile, folded into leather, was not a guide anymore, but a reminder of what obsession could cost. The mountains did not kill with cruelty, they killed with indifference. Snow fell, shadows moved, stone shifted. Hunters wrote their notes, drew their sketches, marked the dawn light, and then vanished, as if the land had simply refused them. Those who came after often spoke not of treasure, but of weight, the weight of silence in their families, the weight of unfinished ledgers. the weight of names never carved into stone. The gold may still lie buried, but what it left above ground was clearer. Grief that stretched across generations, regret that never softened, and a story that collapsed men long before it collapsed into myth. And always the same question: was it gold they lost their lives for, or the silence that guarded it? If you want to understand the treasure of the Rockies, you don't begin with the gold. You begin with the silence. It lingers in the ledges left behind, thin volumes carried into mountains, filled with steady handwriting that weakens, breaks, and finally stops. Some pages list dates, distances, notes on weather. Others sketch cairns and ridges, symbols that echo those found on LeBlanc's silk map. And then, abruptly, nothing. One journal ends with the words, "Sun obscured," and the rest of the page is blank. Another records, "The mound found," before the ink trails into a blot, as though the pen slipped from the writer's hand. Still another has only the faint outline of boots etched on the margin. No explanation, no continuation. These silences say as much as the words. Hunters carried more than tools. They carried paper, ink, rulers, compasses, the instruments of memory. They wanted their efforts to be recorded, proven, passed on. Yet the very record of their searches reveals collapse. The smell of damp paper, the feel of brittle sheets, the fading ink that flakes away beneath touch. These are the survivors of the story, as haunting as any chest of bullion. The family copies of the map are no different, each one incomplete. The silk version smelled faintly of smoke, as if they had traveled through campfires. Later, copies drawn on linen lost detail, adding words like dig or here, then leaving sentences unfinished. Each variation carried both certainty and failure. Luxury appeared, but only as absence. The ornate chests filled with ingots, smooth as glass, were never unearthed. The chalice etched in gold was spoken of more often than seen. Even the silk, folded into leather cases, carried with it not triumph but fragility. The material lasted, the truth did not. In time, silence became the truest inheritance. Families kept maps locked away in trunks. Pages were left half-written, deliberately or by force of exhaustion. Hunters refused to speak of what they had seen. Whole expeditions vanished without leaving more than a few broken lines in notebooks, as though the mountain itself demanded their silence. There is grief in those blanks, regret in every page that ends without conclusion, collapse written not in drama, but in absence. Would you trust a map that refuses to finish its own sentences? Would you read a ledger that trails off mid-line and believe it could lead you to gold? Or would you see those silences for what they are, not mistakes, but warnings? Warnings that the mountain keeps its own records. That silence can be stronger than ink. That absence can outlast certainty. The treasure may still be there, beneath stone and shadow, but the silence above ground in the ledgers, in the maps, in the families who refuse to speak, has become its own archive. An archive written not with words, but with what was left unsaid. Obsession does not die when a man fails to return from the mountains. It lingers in his family, carried like a second inheritance. Gold may not have been passed down, but silence, grief, and unfinished searches were. Wives were left with ledgers that ended mid-line, journals half filled with sketches of cairns and symbols. Some placed them in drawers, closing them as though shutting the door on the past. Others left them out in plain sight, reminders of men who promised to return with fortune, but came home with nothing, or never came home at all. Children grew up in houses where the word treasure meant absence. They touched the leather cases that held folded maps, smelled the faint smoke in silk stained with years of handling, but were not allowed to ask questions. To speak too much of the map was to invite its weight back into the house, and so silence became ritual. But silence does not stop curiosity. Sons traced the symbols when their elders turned away. They drew the boots, the chalice, the mountain ridge with the notch. They repeated the story of the dawn shadow that pointed toward earth, as if the telling itself was enough to keep their fathers alive in memory. Some left to follow the symbols themselves. Many did not return. For these families, luxury was never comfort, it was burden. A gold chalice described but never shown, haunted generations, whispered of in kitchens where no one dared confirm its existence. An ornate chest filled with bullion was remembered not for what it might hold, but for the lives lost in trying to open it. Even the silk map, smooth, fragile, beautiful, was feared. It had outlasted too many men. The obsession spread beyond bloodlines. Neighbors, friends, strangers drawn by rumor became part of the inheritance. A farmer lent his tools to a search party and never saw them again. A blacksmith followed the expedition's marks on stone and froze in a storm. Families who had never touched the map still carried its grief, watching loved ones vanish into the mountains because of symbols they could not ignore. And always, the silence returned. When hunters died, their ledgers came back incomplete. When families lost sons, they turned inward, speaking less, keeping their grief private. The silence grew heavier with each generation, as if it were part of the treasure itself. By the 20th century, the obsession no longer belonged only to descendants. It had become part of American folklore. Yet for those whose names were tied to LeBlanc, it remained deeply personal. Their inheritance was not just the hope of bullion, it was the weight of knowing how many had already collapsed in the search. What would you have done if the silk map had been handed to you? Would you have folded it back into its leather case and placed it in a drawer, determined never to risk your family on its silence? Or would you have carried it into the mountains, chasing the chalice, the boots, the shadow, unable to rest until you had tried? The families who lived with that choice could not all answer the same way. Some guarded silence, some chased the symbols, all carried the obsession. An obsession, unlike gold, does not stay buried. Every generation of hunters believed they had come closer than those before. And in their journals, there are passages where hope breaks through the silence. Sudden, desperate flashes of discovery, recorded with trembling hands. One ledger describes a chest-shaped hollow in the ground, its outline crisp in the dirt. The hunter who found it swore he could feel the edges with his fingers. He wrote of the smell of damp soil clinging to his hands, of how his heart raced as he reached deeper, expecting to touch wood or iron. But when others returned with him, the hollow had collapsed. Nothing remained but rock and water. Another account tells of a tunnel cut into granite. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and age. The walls bore marks that looked like the strokes of picks, the stone smoothed in ways nature rarely leaves. The hunter who entered expected to see ingots stacked in the dark, bars of bullion smooth as glass, stored in ornate chests lined with iron. Instead, he found only stone. The tunnel ended, as though whoever carved it had abandoned the work halfway, or as though someone had removed what was there long before. Others claimed they had touched fragments, a piece of silk, frayed at the edge, folded into a pack and carried home. A cup of dull metal that might once have been gold, its surface tarnished, its weight uncertain. A set of boots unearthed from beneath stone, the leather cracked, initials scratched faintly on the heel. Each artifact was described with conviction, but none were kept long enough to prove. They slipped back into trunks, or were dismissed as coincidence, or simply disappeared into silence. Even the chalice, always the chalice, returned in whispers. One man claimed it had been seen in a farmhouse, kept in a trunk, at the foot of a bed, heavy in the hand, etched with strange marks. Another swore it had been melted down, its gold scattered into coins to avoid suspicion. Neither version could be proven. The chalice remained a symbol more powerful than any chest of bullion. For hunters, these illusions were not failures. They were confirmations. A hollow in the ground meant someone had been there before. A tunnel in stone meant effort had been made to hide something. A fragment of silk meant the original map had touched the mountain. Each absence was treated as presence, each silence as proof. But for families who buried the men who never returned, these discoveries felt different. They were not signs of fortune. They were reminders of collapse. Each chest-shaped hollow was another grave. Each tunnel was another wasted year. Each boot left behind was another body missing. The silk was no longer treasure. It was grief, folded into fabric. And still, the illusion of discovery drew men back. Because what else could explain the persistence of these symbols? Why would the chalice appear again and again, if not as a clue? Why would the ledgers record tunnels and cairns, if not as part of a larger truth? Perhaps the greatest cruelty of the mountain was not in denying proof, but in giving just enough to keep the search alive. A shadow that fell across Earth at dawn, a tunnel that led nowhere, a hollow shaped like a chest, all of them close enough to feel like answers, none of them enough to end the silence. By the time the 20th century arrived, the legend of Treasure Mountain had already outlived most of the families who first whispered of it. The gold, if it existed, remained sealed beneath stone. What endured above ground was absence. Absence of proof. Absence of bodies returned from the mountains. Absence of certainty in maps copied too many times. And yet, that absence carried a weight greater than any bullion chest. Families spoke of it quietly. An ornate chest filled with bullion was remembered not as wealth, but as burden. A story repeated with lowered voices, each telling heavier than the last. The chalice, etched in gold, whispered of for generations, became less about treasure and more about loss, a reminder of fathers who never came home. Even the silk folded into its leather case was no longer seen as a key to fortune. It was grief preserved in fabric, passed like an heirloom no one wanted, but no one dared throw away. Children inherited this weight without choice. They opened trunks to find ledgers ending mid-line, sketches of cairns that no longer matched the ridges outside their windows. They touched the brittle paper, smelled the faint mildew of pages carried through rain, and felt the silence pressing in as strongly as any command. Do not ask. Do not go. Do not chase what has already taken too much. And yet, some did. The silence did not stop curiosity, it sharpened it. If so many had died without proof, then perhaps proof must be close. If journals trailed into silence, then perhaps silence was guarding something real. If a chalice was described in such detail, was it not more than myth? Absence fed obsession. Hunters from far away came to stand on ridges at dawn, waiting for the shadow that was said to fall across stone at 6. They watched the light stretch, saw it point to earth, dug until their hands blistered. Nothing. But when they returned home, they told the story as though they had brushed against truth. Every empty tunnel became evidence that something had once been there. Every collapsed cairn was read as a sign of disturbance. Every silence was treated as proof. But absence is not proof. It is burden. And the longer it lingered, the heavier it became. Imagine carrying that silence through generations. A grandfather folding the silk back into leather, refusing to explain. A father sitting at the table, his hand hovering over the map before pulling it away. A mother describing boots carved in stone, then falling quiet, her eyes clouded with memories too sharp to share. The absence grew heavier than gold itself, because gold can be lifted, carried, spent. Absence can only be endured. And so by the modern age, the treasure was no longer a fortune buried beneath mountains. It was the weight of everything that had been lost in its name. Men, families, years, words that trailed into silence. The chalice, the silk, the boots, the ornate chests. They survived as memory, not proof, as questions, not answers. And for those who inherited the silence, the question was never whether the gold remained. It was whether they could live with the weight of absence it left behind. The search for French gold in the Rockies has lasted more than 2 centuries. If the ingots were ever real, smooth bars stacked in ornate chests lined with iron, they remain beneath stone. If the chalice etched in gold was more than memory, it is still hidden in silence. But the truth is that the treasure no longer lives underground. It lives in the stories. In the silk map folded into leather, its ink faded, its symbols never agreeing. In the journals that trail into nothing, the last words breaking off midline. In the boots, stiff and cracked, remembered as much as relics as they are as warnings. In the absence that grew heavier than the bullion itself, gold was the excuse. Silence became the inheritance. Every generation has believed they were closer. Every hunter has felt, for a moment, that the ground beneath their boots was ready to give way, to reveal the smooth edge of a chest, the glint of bullion, the curve of a chalice. And every time, the ground remained quiet. That quiet is the true treasure, not because it enriches, but because it endures. It has outlasted men, families, nations. It has turned grief into ritual, regret into legend, obsession into history. The treasure never ends because the silence never ends. And that silence still asks the same question. If the chalice were placed in your hands, if the map on silk were unrolled before you, would you trust it? Would you follow the symbols into mountains that have already claimed so many lives? Or would you fold it back into leather, knowing that silence may be the only thing worth keeping? But this story is not the last. In our next video, why a treasure hunter spent 7 years on gold that may not exist, we follow a modern searcher who gave nearly a decade of his life to a different legend, convinced that fortune was waiting just beyond the next ridge. What drives a man to sacrifice so much for something that may never have been there at all? If this story lingered with you, let us know. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe so the next forgotten ledger finds you first, before the silence does.